Well, we're here this morning in Rupert Sheldrake's library to have a discussion with Rupert and President of the network, Peter Fenwick, about the theme of the annual meeting, the challenge of dogmatism and fundamentalism in science and religion. I wanted to start by looking at the background of some of the ideas and the situation we find ourselves in from the 17th century, the development of the scientific and materialist worldview in the 17th century, and ask Rupert first how he sees the importance, the developments of that time in relation to the situation in which we find ourselves now.
One of the first things that happened in the foundations of modern science in the early 17th century was a deliberate separation of the subjective realm from the so-called objective. So what Galileo said that what he called secondary qualities, which is sounds, smells, colours, what philosophers now called qualia, the qualities of experience, were not part of the objective world. They were produced by our minds, by our subjective realm, and that was separate from the realm that science investigated. Descartes made this separation much more extreme a decade or two later, creating what's called Cartesian dualism. There's the realm of matter, which is extended in space and you can measure and quantify. That's what science investigates. There's the realm of consciousness or mind, which is human minds, angels and God, which is non-physical, not in space and time, and totally separate. And science has confined itself since then to the material world, which means, of course, it has no explanation for consciousness. And this is still one of the biggest problems in science. I have a 7-year-old godson who sent me an email this morning saying, "Dear Rupert, I was awake last night because I realised I didn't understand what is it that makes my arm go up when I decide to raise my arm, or makes my eyes blink. Is it the mind, and how does it work?"
Yes.
Well, a very reasonable question. I've had to email him back this morning saying no one knows. This really is one of the big unsolved problems of science.
Yes, and there's also the desacralization of nature, isn't it, at the same time, which is part of the same process.
That's right. It means withdrawal of soul and spirit from the whole natural world. So the realm of spirits and God and so on is supernatural, beyond nature, not in the physical world at all. That means that the whole earth and the whole universe simply become dead, inanimate matter in motion, described by the laws of physics.
Yes, and we could go off in that direction, but just to set that kind of context.
Yes.
Peter, how do you see the influence of the 17th century on our current view?
It's had an absolutely profound effect in structuring science. I was always brought up to look at the objective, the primary qualities of Galileo, and consciousness was never mentioned in my early science courses. What we were talking about was levels of alertness. And if you dared to mention consciousness, it was absolutely and totally wrong. And the way that you were brought up was always to look at the objective. You weren't allowed any feelings at all in your science. And the question is, where did this come from? Why couldn't scientists be creative and express their feelings in what they did and what they wrote? And it seems to me that it goes right back to Descartes and the problems that science had in trying to distance itself from modern philosophy at that time. Montaigne was very clear. He talked about the passions of the individual, talked about the mind, he talked about the wholeness of the person, whereas Descartes says quite clearly that he talks masked. What he means by that is that the intellect is okay, what the intellect constructs is okay, but the actual passions of the individual should never come in to these intellectual formulations. And that, together with the ideas of Galileo and his primary and secondary qualities, set a very rigid framework within which science evolved. And this is one of the difficulties that we have today, trying to expand that. And
there was also the whole question of liberation from the superstitions of medieval church as well. So there's this liberation, Enlightenment liberation, which of course one could argue maybe has gone too far now. But this was another factor, wasn't it, in in the development of scientific thinking.
I think so, and I think in the 17th century, after all, we have the 30 Years' War. Descartes' vision, this vision of a mechanical universe, happened when he was a mercenary soldier in winter quarters, about to attack Prague at the beginning of the 30 Years' War of 1619. And Protestants and Catholics were killing each other all over Europe. There was an appalling period of disruption. In England we had the Civil War. And there was a tremendous amount of religious strife. And for a lot of people, science represented what they called the third way. It was an attempt to rise above all that into a realm of objective truth, of mathematical certainty, way beyond the realm of demagogues and religious orators and enthusiasts, and a calm, objective world of reason.
Reason, exactly.
And that's, of course, what was so attractive to a lot of people. It did seem liberating, and it laid the foundations for the Enlightenment cult of reason and progress.
Exactly, which we'll come back to.
Yes, but let's understand that it was liberating. It was fantastic, because a lot of the superstitions, particularly the witches' trials, in which somebody would come before the court and say a baby had appeared in the milk which had gone sour, all that sort of rank, clear superstition could at last fall away. So it was a really very powerful move in the intellectual development of that time. And we tend to forget that the beginnings of science were embedded in the culture of that time, and their embedment in the culture that we have has gone on since then. And I don't know if you were brought up, Rupert, but I was always brought up to think that science had the answer. It could detect truth. There was no question about it. If there was a scientific fact, there was a scientific fact, and we all had to believe it. And there was nothing about culture at that time. There was no way that we would discuss culture. In fact, it wasn't really till Thomas Kuhn came on the scene and pointed this out to us.
I mean, can we move on perhaps to how you became interested in this whole question of consciousness, and how your work developed from that interest, Rupert?
I started off as a biologist working on developmental biology. For reasons to do with developmental biology, I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields that organize living organisms. I came to the conclusion that to understand how a plant grows, it's not enough just to know about genes, molecules, proteins, and cell biology. We need a more integrated, holistic understanding. So this idea of fields, first thought of by me in connection with chemicals, molecules, crystals, and plants, and then animal embryos, extended then to behavior. And I realized then that there must be a field theory of mind as well. This got me interested in learning, memory, behavior, consciousness. So I started as a biologist, moving out from a field theory of developmental biology to a field theory of mind. And then that led me to an interest in testing this. And there are various ways you can test this theory. Morphic resonance is part of my theory, the idea there's a memory in nature. That means that if rats learn a new trick in one place, rats elsewhere in the world should learn it quicker. That can be tested with animals and with people, and quite a number of tests have been done. The extended mind also means that when we look at something, we're connected with what we look at, and our mind reaches out through fields, and therefore we can affect what we look at. And that led me to my research on the sense of being stared at. If you look at someone from behind, they don't know you're there, can they feel it? Most people have had that experience. Experiments show that people can indeed detect it. And then we're connected with people who we have social bonds with. Those connections endure at a distance, and I think that's the basis of telepathy. That led me to my research on telephone telepathy and telepathy between dogs and their owners, in research on dogs that know when their owners are coming home.
We'll go into a little more detail on that perhaps in a moment. But I know that your views evolved, partly as a result of reading birdsong. Isn't that correct?
Yes, well that was quite early on in this process. When I was a Don in Cambridge, I was a fellow of Clare. I was working on developmental biology. I already came to the conclusion morphogenetic fields were a key part of it. And when I read Bergson's book, Matter and Memory, and it made a huge impression because Bergson shows that memory doesn't have to be material, it's a relation in time, and the idea that memory is stored in the brain, he showed is actually a false conception of memory. I found it tremendously persuasive, and by generalizing his ideas about memory, I came to the idea of memory in all nature through morphic resonance, with each species having a kind of collective memory. But the stimulus for that really was Bergson, and I was wrestling with the idea of transmission of influence over time, which I thought must be happening in nature,
Yes.
in biology and in evolution. I'd already come to that conclusion, and I just couldn't see how this could work. And then when I read Bergson, it was a liberation for me. It fell into place.
Yes, and you also had a professor, I believe, who had some interesting experiences in Cambridge.
Well, I had several very good mentors and guides in Cambridge, and actually one of them was a professor of history. No, he was a don in history in my college, Charles Parkin, he was called, who was keen on L.L. White and holistic philosophy in general, and I'd never heard of all that. So he was enormously helpful to me in making me aware of the broader currents of holistic thinking.
Yes. And Peter, what was your experience at an earlier stage when generating your interest in consciousness?
My experience is very straightforward. When you went to a physiology book in the 50s and you looked up consciousness in the index, it wasn't there. And as I said before, it was just levels of alertness. And there were these lovely diagrams which showed how you became more alert as you became stimulated, and then your alertness fell off at the end as you became overstimulated. And that was what consciousness was. It was dealing with ideas like that. But actual consciousness itself, there was nothing. And it was a huge gap. And one was all the time going back to Sherrington with his lovely view of the energy theory. Light came in to the eyes, was transmitted by the nerves to the cortex. There was the magic of the enchanted loom, and then science put its finger to its lips and was silent as to how this was created. And that was the area in which we grew up. And as I went to the Maudsley and learnt about philosophy and particularly about the analysts, it became quite clear that there was a huge gap here. Freud would take mental states as far as the mind. For example, if somebody had a transcendent state where they touched the corners of the universe, this was seen as a neurosis. Now, how could it be a neurosis? It was an astonishing thing to say. And we came up through the French philosophers and the idea of hysteria, the wandering of the female womb. These were the sort of ideas we were brought up on. Well, your womb's wandering a bit today, Rupert. Well, I know you don't have one, but if you had one, then you would have the Bakers, and say it was all wandering wombs. There was nothing about consciousness. It was really very difficult because there are these fantastic mental states, very wide mental states, and one had to go along the analytical path. The only person was Jung, who saw a much wider view of that. And then with his synchronicity, his interconnectedness, and that leading one on to ideas in parapsychology, led to the view that consciousness clearly wasn't limited to the brain. And at that point, one was a heretic. And things became difficult with one's colleagues.
And that, I think, is one of the interesting patterns, isn't it, which obviously we want to look at. The notion of a heretic in science as opposed to a heretic in theology. And luckily, one no longer gets burned at the stake, but one's reputation is very much at stake.
Yes, I think metaphorically one is burnt at the stake. I don't think there's much doubt about that, in the sense that you have to do two things if you're not going to get literally burnt at the stake and thrown out. The first is that you have to be a regular scientist. It's a sort of capital you get. And by doing regular science, you can stop your colleagues from becoming too obnoxious. Because you can say, well, actually, I'm a scientist like you, we're colleagues. But if you don't do that, then you find yourself coming out on the limb and to become quite severely criticised.
So there's a sort of very difficult path to tread, from your experience at Maudsley.
Yes, you have to. All the scientists are speaking masked, as Descartes said. You have to speak masked too. So you will drop your ideas into a scientific framework and then say, well, listen, we can expand it this way. You don't like it, oh well. But I mean, this is a possibility. And so one treads a careful path.
Rupert, what about your experience in this respect?
Well, I suppose I'm one of the few people in the scientific world who's actually been publicly proclaimed a heretic by the editor of Nature, who identifies himself with the Pope. Not the present one, the previous one, Sir John Maddox, as he now is. So when my first book, A New Science of Life, came out, his famous editorial in Nature called A Book for Burning really conjured up all this imagery of book burning and the Inquisition. When he was interviewed years later about this, he said on BBC television, Sheldrake deserves to be condemned for the same reason the Pope condemned Galileo. It's heresy. And, this is, of course, I was flattered by being compared with Galileo, but I think more to the point was he was comparing himself with the Pope. And this whole language of heresy, there's a fixed orthodox belief, things that don't fit in are heresy. This is something really that Kuhn pointed out to us, that science is not a matter of objective truth, it's a social construct, it's a collective system of practice, it's a professional group of people who at any given time broadly share a model of reality, a paradigm, and scientific revolutions are when those models change. But within any given paradigm, things that don't fit in, phenomena that don't fit in are anomalies. Consciousness is an anomaly from the mechanistic point of view. So they're ignored or denied or set aside. And ideas that challenge that framework and suggest a different one are heresies. So Kuhn showed us that science is not so different from religion or any other human construct. It's, as Peter said, the way we were taught it, when I was taught it at school and university, it was treated as absolute truth, objective fact. The idea that it was based on a social construct, that it was grown out of a particular cultural context, and so forth, that just wasn't there. Kuhn woke us up to that, and then feminists pointed out, how male-dominated and filled with male chauvinist ideas a lot of the rhetoric of science was, if not the practice of it. And so we are now much more aware of this cultural conditioning of science. It doesn't alter the fact that in trying to change what goes on in science, you still do run into this kind of heretic boundary. There are certain areas like telepathy that are definitely taboo from the point of view of conventional science. And there are people who see it as their business to defend these taboos.
Yes.
The editor of Nature clearly thought it was his job, and a number of science journalists at present think of themselves as gatekeepers of orthodoxy and defending these taboos.
So you have this pattern in modern times as well as in medieval times of orthodoxy and heresy. And the orthodoxy is backed up by a huge, you might call authoritarian structure behind it. How do you see that, Peter?
I think that there are lovely examples. We can go to consciousness. Let's take Dan Dennett in his book, The Nature of Mind. And here he gives a wonderful description, Dennett's description of what mind is. And he argues that you have to know all about the neurons. And if you know all about the neurons, then you will understand mind and you'll understand consciousness. But most scientists are very badly educated. What they don't know is what Dan Dennett's assumptions are. His assumptions are that you can only see, you can only deal with those things that you can see and measure. That's what he says. He says the mind is a peep show. So there cannot be mind in his formulation. The result is he ends up with saying you have to know all about the actual details of the neurons, and then consciousness will arise. Now, if people were really told what Dan Dennett's assumptions were, they'd all say, well, come on, we actually now believe in downward causation. But that was a major change.
Mm.
Do you remember? It was all neurons going up, and then psychoneuroimmunology came along and said maybe mind can affect these things. And then there was the real difficulties. In fact, Sperry, who got his Nobel Prize for corpus callosum cuts in the early 90s, he made this daring assumption in his Nobel Prize speech that downward causation did occur in the nervous system. Mind could actually change things in the nervous system. It was a radical idea. And I think one hasn't to be too hard on science, because if you take it over a longish period of time, these ideas do come in. Everybody talks now about psychoneuroimmunology. It's quite common that the mind affects the brain, which affects the immune system. And the idea that you get cancers because you're sad is well within our scientific understanding. But try to extend mind outside the brain in the area that you've been doing, Rupert. And then you come up against this very, very strong taboo.
Well, in each of these cases, you have the assumption underlying it that the mind actually produces the brain. The brain produces consciousness.
Yes.
Yes.
And whether it's a mentalism or whether it's identity theory, there are various ways of putting it. It still amounts to a materialistic understanding of consciousness, and this is really the threshold that both of you have expanded beyond, but which is jealously guarded by the orthodox view.
Mm.
Yes, I think it's a shame, really, because there's so many phenomena that are important to us where mind clearly acts beyond the brain. One of the ones which I'm studying at the moment are approaching death experiences, and this is what happens when you die. And there are a whole set of phenomena which occur during the dying process, which suggests extended mind, and before you die, there are questions again about extended mind. For example, you're taken through the dying process by a dead relative. We have lots of accounts of that. At the time of death, the dying person goes to meet somebody else, a telepathic-like experience. And then there are these wonderful things that occur as people die. It's the sort of shaking of the structure of the world. Bells ring, clocks stop, light is seen, things leave the body. It's the most amazing time of death. But from the point of view of our mechanical view, the clock stops and the brain dies, and that's it. But it's
So
not
the
like
extinction
that
of
when you look at
consciousness, but everything that you're finding around near-death experience and nearing-death experience suggests that consciousness is not extinguished. And this is very challenging for the orthodox materialist view.
It's impossible for the orthodox materialists. They don't like it at all. They immediately rationalise it and explain it away.
And how do you see that? Is it possible for a breakthrough to occur in that field? Do you think?
I think that the way the breakthroughs will occur is because the scientific evidence gets to a point where people can't ignore it. When people start doing experiments like Rupert is doing, when people start looking at the dying process, then these things are all there. And providing that people are willing to recognise them, then I think science will move on.
Well, that's a key point, because they don't recognise it. They try and ignore it if possible, or explain it away. Perhaps you talk a little bit about the reactions to some of your more recent work you put on telephone and email telepathy. I believe you've got some new experiments running at the moment as well.
Yes, I've got some new ones running on the internet at the moment. Well, I mean, there's a fairly predictable set of responses to this. I mean, these are taboo topics, anything to do with telepathy, anything that suggests the mind is more than just the brain. And this came into focus in 2006 when I gave a talk along with Peter at the British Association for the Advancement of Science Annual Festival of Science.
Organised by the network.
Organised by the network. And at the press conference in the morning, it was clear that this was attracting much more attention from the media than most of the other worthy talks, some of which one could say were rather dull as part of the conference.
Yes.
And the attention that this generated, Peter talking about near-death and nearing-death experiences, my work on telephone telepathy, Deborah Delanoy's talk on reviewing work in parapsychology, generated a great deal of interest, and precisely because of that, it led to a backlash, and some science journalists who themselves are committed to a very mechanistic, dogmatically materialist point of view, fanned up a controversy by interviewing people they knew were against these things, to say it was all rubbish, and then they attacked the British Association for allowing these topics to be discussed. And this was all over the Times and a number of papers. It was a row really stirred up by journalists, but the fact is it dominated the press coverage of the entire British Association Festival of Science.
Indeed.
And
yes.
the reason for that is precisely because it's controversial, precisely because a lot of people are interested in these things, but also because a taboo had been violated on what they thought of as the kind of sacred ground of the British Association. Interestingly enough, although the Times ran 2 pages denouncing telepathy and the British Association on its science pages, the assistant editor rang me up and asked me to do a 1,000-word feature for their opinion pages, putting my point of view. They also had an editorial the very same day as this denunciation in the science pages, saying, what's all the fuss about? Everybody knows telepathy happens.
Yes.
So
yes.
the point is, as soon as you move outside the narrow world of science into the more general society, then most people take it for granted. So we have here, in the larger context, a small, embattled subculture within the world of science, to which most intellectuals feel they have to pay at least lip service,
Yes.
because this is the Enlightenment, scientific, rational, as they see it, point of view. And people like Peter and me are not saying we're against reason and science. On the contrary, we're saying we're in favour of reason and science, and that we need more of it, not less. We just need to expand
Precisely.
the frontiers of science, rather than turning science into a kind of fundamentalist, dogmatic belief system. It's a system of inquiry, not a system of setting limits to what you can talk about.
Indeed.
I absolutely agree with you, Rupert, and I was heartened by the Times because I was also given the opportunity to have a feature in the Times, which I thought was really very nice, and clearly the editors felt that this was the scientific establishment striking at something which wasn't there at all. And if the scientific journalists now took the trouble to go along to a lot of the more advanced meetings, even in the Royal Society itself, they would see that things have changed completely. There's a very nice talk given there by Schwartz, looking at the mathematics of von Neumann and the idea that the von Neumann, what's called von Neumann II process, which is one in which the quantum mechanical effects occur in large objects, can take place, and was written up in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And the argument that the authors ended with was that it's quite clear that consciousness is now outside the brain, and that mental effects affect the brain. And you were beginning to talk a little bit about telepathy between 2 people and how telepathy continued with the relationship at a distance. And this is exactly what they were saying. And one of the lovely experiments is such a simple one, and we've known it for years, and this is the placebo experiment. Give somebody a piece of chalk and tell them it is the most fantastic dopamine agonist, particularly if you have Parkinson's chemical, and then measure the way the dopamine receptors change in the brain, and you show that the dopamine goes up and it's much more powerful than some of the dopamine agonist drugs. Now that is pure embedding in the cultural context. And once you get that sort of data coming through, you cannot argue anymore for just the play of neurons. It's got to be something much wider.
I think one of the other philosophical factors is the fear of dualism in
Yes.
science. Sir John Eccles put forward a dualistic understanding of mind-brain interaction, but he's a heretic, or what knows, he's regarded as a heretic. And so there are huge efforts going on to try and maintain the position of consciousness within the brain. And if one goes to your work, Peter, and which not only in near-death experiences, but also if you push it one stage further to survival of consciousness, or indeed the work of Ian Stevenson on memories of previous lives, then you cannot maintain the position anymore, that consciousness cannot exist independently of brain processes.
It becomes very difficult to do that because the evidence for post-death communications is very strong and very good. And I think what we need is much more science on it now, because you can't get funding for these things. We put this is to deal with near-death experiences and veridical perception, we put a grant into a very famous medical charity in this country. And they said, the science is great, well done. Yeah, you can go into the casualty department, and in people with cardiac arrests, you can find out what they experience, that's fine. But you're not allowed to put your boards up in case they leave their bodies and see the boards, which is what we want you to do. And they said, no, you may not do that part of the experiment. Why? Because they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified that they will have broken one of these rigid taboos of mind and brain being very closely linked, and in fact, as you said, mind created by brain. They wouldn't do it.
But can you actually see that situation changing? Because supposing we had a rerun of the British Association meeting in 2008, I would anticipate a similar reaction. Or do you think there's a way of getting beyond that?
Well, I do. The thing is, you get the similar reaction because the same science journalists are on the Times and so on. And you've got the same people around who put forward these reactionary quotes. And Professor Peter Atkins said, telepathy is nothing but a charlatan's fantasy. When I discussed it with him on BBC Radio 5, he said he hadn't. I asked him if he'd looked at the evidence. He said, of course not, but I'd be very suspicious of it. And you know, he doesn't need to look at the evidence. He knows the truth. And Richard Dawkins is very similar. There are plenty of people who they're not going to change. But my own view is that what's happening is that there are these very dogmatic people who are called upon by the press because they can be guaranteed to make clear statements that are easy to quote, sound bites.
Yes.
They reinforce the prejudices of some science journalists. But the fact is, most people within the scientific world, in my opinion and experience, are not as dogmatic. What we have is in place a kind of social constraint. Most scientists don't speak out for fear of being thought peculiar, weird or something, but actually the number who really believe this dogmatic materialism is a minority. I think it's a bit
like... a very vociferous one.
Yes, a vociferous one. I think it's a bit like the state of materialism in Russia in the time of Brezhnev. You know, in the Soviet Union there was an official belief in materialism,
yes.
Marxism.
Yes.
If you didn't pay lip service to it in public, it seriously damaged your career. But how many people really believed it? When the Soviet Union collapsed, I mean, how many totally committed communists are there in Russia today? I mean, not that many, there are some. But I think science is like that, and I think that within scientific institutions there's a large minority, and in many institutions a majority, who don't really buy into this materialist dogma. They pretend to during working hours. But if you talk to people in the evening over a glass of wine, you find much broader and more interesting views. I think what will bring about the change is something more analogous to the gay liberation movement. You know, science is full of closet holists.
Yes.
My idea is that if people come out of the closet, they'll find that in almost every scientific department there are people interested in these questions. They'd then be able to discuss them in the tea room, and instead of keeping quiet and only talking in the evenings to their friends or family about them.
Of course, this was actually one of the rationales of originating the Scientific and Medical Network, so that people could come out of the closet and talk among rational people themselves about these topics which you've been describing as taboo.
Yes, so it was a safe house, really.
Yes.
Where people could do that.
But you see, that's the first stage, is for people to cease feeling they're isolated and that there's no one else you can talk to.
Yes.
But now what happens is that instead of the Scientific and Medical Network just being a group of people voluntarily join and meet other like-minded people, we need this in every science department, as it were, that people would feel this is modelled what can be done when scientists really talk to each other without fear and can explore questions that really interest them. But we need to take this model out. It needs to be something that can actually be done in normal science departments.
No, I think that's a very good point. And can we move on now to the wider issue of what people are calling the new atheism, the obviously polarization between creationism and atheism, and the public debate that's going on at the moment, which some people say is as vociferous as what was going on in the 1860s, and that there hasn't been so much interest in this interface and the question of the existence of God and the relationship between science and religion, since that time. Some of these books on new atheism have sold hundreds of thousands of copies, whereas the refutations of them by people like Keith Ward hardly sell anything at all, and they get very little publicity. And so there's another issue about the media exposure of atheism and those sort of positions as against the sort of level of debate that one would expect in the media, of looking at alternative views.
Well, I was just going to comment on that, and this is really to do with publicity. The publicity machine for Dawkins's book would be very much better than the publicity machine for Keith Ward's book. I don't know how many television shows Keith Ward went on, but I suspect that they were a fraction of the ones that Dawkins went on when his book came out. And in one sense, it's much easier to say something absolutely ridiculous like Dawkins does, and people can grasp the concept very quickly. And it makes much better television than a more reasoned debate that Keith Ward would give. But
I think also, there are certain elements of the atheist critique of religion which many people would agree with. We started by talking about the 30 Years' War and the intolerance and the fanaticism.
Yes.
And this is something that people with a different view and different use of reason would be talking about. We could readily agree with that. But it doesn't mean to say that we are just as bad as the rest of them, as it were.
I think that the reason for the rise of the new atheism was people were frightened of Islamic fundamentalism, they're frightened of the Christian right, they don't like George Bush, and they identify George Bush with right-wing Christianity, creationism, and so forth. So there are lots of reasons why I think that the materialist orthodoxy, the people who believe in the kind of Enlightenment rationalism in its rather dogmatic form, felt threatened. And I think this is a backlash, this evangelical atheism that's going on at the moment. I think in a way it's done as a service. I think probably in America it was liberating for a lot of people to be able to come out in the open and say they were atheists. And most people in England seem to be atheists in the open. It's not an issue here, but in America it was an issue. But I think above all what they've done is people like Dawkins have crystallised the atheist materialist position, put it there in a clear form that you can actually see what this belief system is. I found it very hard to argue against atheism and materialism until recently, because there were very few examples where people had actually stated it explicitly. It was a kind of implicit belief system, very widespread among intellectuals and scientists, but implicit and elusive, because they'd say, oh, that's not what I really mean, or something, when you dealt with one of the more ridiculous points. Dawkins puts it all out there in a very clear way, and so do his co-religionists, his co-atheists, the Hitchens and people. Polemical, strident, but put there in a sort of clear way. And it's easier to see what the belief system is that they're defending. And I think that precisely because of that, its limitations are now becoming much more apparent.
So there's a sort of dialectical process, so one can get a handle on it, and therefore one can respond.
Yes,
more clearly.
Exactly, and I think that it enables clearer responses to be made. There are all sorts of responses that people have made. Religious wars, okay, what about Stalin? He's an atheist. It's now clear to most people that lots of human beings have behaved badly, including atheists, and there's actually some flaw in human nature.
Well,
that's not exactly a new insight.
No, as Keith Ward said recently at the meeting we had in Cambridge, he said it's not religion that's dangerous, it's human beings who are dangerous.
Yes.
Now, just to finish off, how would you forecast the general view on consciousness in, let's say, 20 years' time? How do you think things might have changed? Or do you have two scenarios that you could maybe speculate on?
I think that my own views about this is that the views on consciousness are going to change, and really quite dramatically. They're going to do it in two ways. A, because there is going to be a lot more evidence for mind beyond the brain, and people will have to start incorporating that into their theories. But I think the other point is that our understanding of the actual physics of the world itself is slowly changing, so that the idea that you can have systems, complex systems like brains, which are isolated, is going to be seen as frankly ridiculous, particularly because they have their tentacles out into the social processes and distant perceptual processes. So I think that consciousness is going to become much more scientifically acceptable, and the theories are going to involve the extension of mind at a distance. So my own view is that it's going to go on in the way that we see these very, very, very early, tenuous beginnings.
Rupert?
Yes, I think so too. I agree with that. And I think one of the things that's happened is as a result of the fact that consciousness is now firmly on the scientific agenda. For the last 15 or 20 years, the debate has been intensifying about consciousness. Like Peter, when I was a student, I was studying physiology at Cambridge. It wasn't mentioned. It was ignored completely.
Yes, yes.
Now it's not ignored, and there's lots of books and discussions and conferences on consciousness. And when the materialists push their views of consciousness to the limits that people like Dennett and Nicholas Humphrey do, it becomes clear that this position is very hard to defend. It's untenable, that you can't just conjure consciousness up from blind in physical processes that totally lack it. They're trying to pull the rabbit of consciousness out of the hat as if by magic, and it just doesn't work. And when you look at the arguments, when they're subjected to scrutiny, it turns out they don't hold up very well. And I think that within the consciousness studies area, first the idea was in the 70s and 80s that the brain's just a computer doing information programming.
Yes.
And
Yes.
now they've dropped that. Now,
Yes.
now Damasio comes along and says, well, actually our mental processes are influenced by emotion. Well, this is big news in the scientific world. I mean, it's not big news to most people,
No, quite.
certainly not to
Yes.
most women. And then they now discover that our minds are embodied, that it's not just disembodied information processing. So we've now got, as mainstream views, that we have embodied minds influenced by emotion. Now, we're more or less now at the level that common sense has been at forever.
Yes.
But
Yes.
this has come into science, and so
Yeah.
even within mainstream, so this process is leading to a broadening of the view of consciousness. And I think, as Peter says, more research and more interest in this topic is going to break out of this narrow dogmatic limitation. I think these things are bound to change. And the people who are defending the old orthodoxy, dogmatic materialism, dogmatic atheism, are now being seen increasingly by most other people as exactly that, dogmatic. And I think there are a lot of people who'd like to see science being much more open, more curious, including a lot of young people, and including a lot of people who now work within science who come from non-Western backgrounds, from India, from China, from South America, people who haven't got any particular axe to grind for this particular kind of European 19th century atheism. It's after all never taken very deep root even in the US.
No.
It's a peculiarly cultural phenomenon of Western Europe in reaction against the Catholic Church and the Protestant reformers and so forth. It's come out of this particular kind of atheism is a kind of extreme Protestantism that's sort of turned on religion itself. It's culturally limited, and it's not really relevant to people coming from other cultures who increasingly make up a lot of the proportion of people working within science. I think it's bound to change.
Well, Peter and Rupert, thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure that will have given rise to many questions and points of discussion.
Well, thank you.
Great, thank
Good.
you. Excellent.
Great.